22,
23,
24, 25, 26, 27, 28.
Tucson celebrated a milestone earlier this year that you might have missed. A fish that hadn't been seen in this stretch of the Santa Cruz River for about a century came back with the help of some scientists. The fish called the longfin dace arrives in 5-gallon buckets, rigged with foam and duct tape to keep the temperature comfortable. The researchers strap them to their backs and bring them to the bank of the river. When they get to the bank, they slowly add river water to the buckets to help them adjust. You know how when you bring a fish home from the pet store, you leave them in the bag and let it sit in the tank long enough to hit the same temperature? That's exactly what they're doing here.
A third, basically, so remove a third of your water and add a third of this water.
And once the water in the buckets reaches the river's temperature, the researchers release the fish.
They're headed upstream, maybe? No, there's some downstream. Yeah, there's a little school going downstream.
But for the fish to come back, water had to come back. I'm Megan Myskowski, and this is Tapped, a podcast where we tell our stories, the stories of people living with the cost of drought in the Southwest, and what we can do to mitigate it. On this episode, water is coming back to the Santa Cruz River in Tucson, despite the drought, but it took a lot of work to get it there. Michael Bogan is a researcher with the University of Arizona, and he sort of keeps an eye on the river. I went to see him there a couple months before he helped get the longfin dace back in it.
We are in the Santa Cruz River bed at Star Pass, or 22nd Street.
There are rock and cement walls on either side of us that lead up to a bike path in the parking lot. And around us is a rocky riverbank and flowing water.
So in a traditional river, we would consider this the headwaters, right? Because it's where the water starts in the river channel. It's just in this case, instead of the headwaters being like Mount Lemmon or a mountaintop or a glacier, we have the headwaters being a pipe for this part of the reach.
There are a few trees and bushes down here too.
This is a small sapling of what's called seep willow. So it's a really big riparian plant along desert streams. And so it's really fun to see this shrub come back. It'll eventually grow to be about 7 or 8 feet tall.
Where we're standing in the river was dry until just 2019. So everything here, like the plants, the animals, it's all pretty new.
This is an isolated stretch of the river. It's not connected by water to other flowing parts of the river. So everything has to, fly or hop or crawl to get here. So part of the fun from an ecology perspective is just seeing, which species show up, how soon they show up, how diverse it gets, and how quickly it gets diverse.
When we say it's new, we mean it's new to people who've been living here. Most people living in Tucson now know the Santa Cruz River as a dry riverbed, unless a monsoon has recently passed through. After getting used to seeing it completely dry, what we're looking at feels like a lot of water. But this spot where we're standing used to be pretty wet.
So let's go back to, say, 1910. You would have seen about the same amount of water here during the dry season. So a river that's a little too wide to hop across, but easy to wade through or get across. And you would have seen some of these same plants that we're seeing growing along the river channel. The big difference is that we wouldn't be down in a ditch like we are now. We're down in this flood control channel. It would have been more of an open floodplain, and the river would have been moving back and forth between Sentinel Peak and what's now downtown Tucson, and we would have seen cottonwoods and willow trees growing along the banks. And in addition to that, you would have seen irrigation canals being diverted from the river, so that water that flowed in the river year-round would have gone out to farms on either side of the river.
If you think back to the episode with Giselle Ramon-Salbaron at the Santa Vera Indian Reservation, you'll remember that this is how people have farmed here for many, many generations. And you'll remember that her grandma used to play in the water just downstream. and tell Giselle stories that seemed completely remarkable to her, because she'd grown up with a dry riverbed.
We've had generations of Tucsonans who grew up thinking that there's not supposed to be water in the Santa Cruz River, right? So they've grown up thinking the river is a dry wash. But that was not the case for thousands and thousands of years, right? The river was supposed to have water downtown Tucson.
And that dryness wasn't just a problem with the river.
I'm a Tucson resident, lived here a long time. I work on water policy and management and give lots of talks.
That's Sharon Megdal. She heads the Water Research Resource Center at the University of Arizona, and she's worked on water in the state for decades. She even led a regional water district in the 90s.
So I really learned about water through the practice of water management rather than book learning through coursework.
When you think of Tucson, you probably think about it as a city that's mostly at peace with its place in the desert, right? Zero-escape lawns, crusty conservationists. That might be true, but a lot of that came as a response to a problem. A pretty big one that peaked in the 70s.
Well, Tucson, as I believe the largest city in the United States that had been dependent on groundwater, and maybe in the world, it was way up there.
Tucson at that time was entirely reliant on groundwater because the surface water, like the water that came from the Santa Cruz, had mostly dried up. As the population grew, Tucson dug deeper and deeper for more. The city was reliant on groundwater for so long that at one point it became the only city in the US of its size solely using groundwater. And groundwater is finite. The city tried to incorporate surface water treatment plants, but residents pushed back over the burst pipes and brown water that followed.
And there was no reason for a place like Phoenix to do anything other than what they were doing. But in Tucson, the utility thought it was going to do something. It tried to do something. It was a failure.
A little further up the river, I meet Fernando Molina. He worked for Tucson Water for 30 years, partially in the conservation program and partially as a spokesperson. We go to the Sweetwater Wetlands. It's both a water treatment facility and a wildlife habitat in the middle of Tucson. People even come here from all over the country to go birding.
People come here to learn about water. They come to look at the view of wildlife. You put water out in the desert and you're guaranteed to get wildlife coming out here.
But this has only been here since the 90s, after Tucson got serious about its water supply.
When we had problems meeting demands, when people were turning on their faucets and turning on their hoses and there was no water coming out. You know, the reliability of the water system is what people pay for, and they weren't getting that.
So there were two big ideas: build more infrastructure and convince people to use less. And asking people to use less was pretty effective.
In the mid-70s, as we look through this graph here, you can see a tremendous drop just from voluntary actions taken by residents in our community here.
We'll talk more in the next episode about how Tucson Water got people to bring down their own water usage. But conservation wasn't going to change the fact that Tucson had a lot of people living on a water source that was only depleting.
The main thing was we needed to invest significantly in infrastructure, and that's a big hit to take all at once. And so several steps were taken.
The first step, they put in new rate structures, and high users especially started paying more for their water.
That was very controversial at the time. There were recalls and there were resignations from the city council, but in the end, the fact of the matter was nothing changed because we still needed to make these investments.
And around the same time, Colorado River water came into the picture. The state had already been working for decades on getting it to the most populated parts of Arizona. It even took California to the Supreme Court over those water rights, and it won. A lot of Tucsonans were not convinced, and there were heated public meetings over bringing in the new source of water. Many couldn't believe it would be reliable. But then, the city council voted 5-2 to start piping it in. Tucson Water upped its efforts to fix leaks, and it started banking water and using recycled wastewater. That recycled water actually moves from where I met Fernando back down to the spot on the Santa Cruz where Michael Bogan goes to test the river.
It's coming from, everybody's bathrooms, everybody's kitchens all across Tucson, going into that treatment plant. It gets treated. From there, it goes to Sweetwater wetlands. And by putting it through wetlands, it gets an additional treatment step. And then from there, it goes in a pipe and actually comes all the way to where we're at now. So I think it's about 6 miles away in a pipe to be released here.
This is the Santa Cruz River Heritage Project, and it's an example of what's called natural infrastructure.
A lot of times that wastewater, that treated wastewater, that effluent is thought of as kind of a nuisance, something you have to get rid of. And so it'll be dumped into an existing river, like in a lot of places. Whereas in Tucson and in a lot of southwestern cities, we're starting to realize this is something we need to hang on to, because we're not getting a lot of additional freshwater supplies from anywhere else. So we not only need to use our water wisely, but we need to reuse our water wisely.
So the city brought water down here just a couple of years ago to do that. And Bogan was here to see it.
There were several hundred people who came out to see that release of the water, the start of flow in the river again. And what caught my eye after, only a few hours of the river flowing was that some dragonflies and damselflies had already found the water. And so that was basically the first aquatic species to be in the river downtown since it dried up, decades and decades ago.
And now he comes down here, sometimes with a team, sometimes on his own, to see how the plant and animal life are doing.
So it's a pretty simple procedure, but what I'm going to just do here is pour this bucket through this fine little aquarium net, making sure I capture all the bugs that are in the water. But I don't really need to take all these rocks and gravel back to the lab with me. I took my trusty collection net that you can see over there and went to several different places through the riverbed and basically disturbed the bottom of the river, the sand and the gravel that's there, and scared the aquatic invertebrates that were in that spot, and they jumped up and they went into my net.
He puts them in a bucket, preserves them, then brings them back to a lab, where he counts and records them.
And so I can see mayflies that are crawling around, I can see some black flies, a little water strider, some dragonfly larvae, there's some snails, aquatic snails crawling around there.
He even has a trail camera fixed to a tree, where he's seen animals like coyotes and bobcats come to relax. And he's seen some tragic ends.
Folks, if you don't keep your cats inside, the coyotes are going to find those cats. And so we do end up capturing a lot of coyotes with feral cats in their mouths. So that's probably the most brutal thing.
But ultimately, for him, this project is a sign that even as the region gets drier, we can still make changes to keep water here.
As long as this project keeps going, we're going to have a new generation of Tucsonans who are used to seeing water here and are used to seeing the greenery and used to seeing the ducks. And they're going to start to think that, just like generations way in the past, that the river is supposed to have water in it. And that awareness and that connection to the river makes me super happy to think about.
Nowadays, the city relies almost entirely on water it banks from the Colorado River. But as that water dwindles, the city will have to rely on creative solutions, like this. On the next episode, Tucson has a very particular look to it. You can drive from the center of town to the surrounding cities, and most of the front yards you'll see have saguaros, prickly pears, and palo verdes.
I mean, the amazing thing about Tucson is, when you get off a plane, step out of the airport, you feel like you're home because it has a very strong sense of place.
The city got that way trying to solve a problem: lack of reliable water. This episode of Tapped was reported, written, and hosted by me, Megan Myskowski. Duncan Moon is our editor, Christopher Conover is our news director at AZPM, Zach Ziegler is our production engineer, and JT Thorpe is our fact checker. The music you're listening to is by Michael Greenwald. Visit our website at azpm.org/tapped for pictures, links, and more.